In the early morning hours, Britain held its breath. At 6 a.m. sharp, a heavily guarded envelope departed Buckingham Palace, its destination unknown, its contents a mystery. Within hours, tremors of uncertainty rippled through the nation. Fear replaced speculation as whispers turned to panic. Something unprecedented had occurred, an act that shattered centuries of royal protocol and constitutional tradition. King Charles had issued an emergency proclamation containing words that would shock the world. Queen Regent Catherine. The newsrooms erupted first. Phones rang without pause. Producers shouted frantically across studios while anchors hesitated, uncertain how to read the words scrolling across their teleprompters. "This is not a drill," one editor whispered, voice trembling. "It's real." From the BBC to Sky News to international outlets, everyone scrambled for confirmation. What began as a rumor had crystallized into undeniable truth. The king had acted decisively, secretly, and without warning. Yet as headlines blazed across every screen from London to New York, the palace gates remained firmly shut and the staff maintained an eerie silence. Something was unfolding behind those iron gates that no one could yet comprehend. Palace courtiers received strict orders, no media communication whatsoever. Reporters once granted access were now barred completely. Guards refused all comments, longtime aides avoided eye contact. It felt as though the monarchy itself had gone underground. An almost sacred heaviness hung in the air, broken only by the echoing footsteps racing through marble corridors. The king had vanished from public view, leaving the nation wondering what force could have compelled such a proclamation. And why now? Social media exploded into chaos. Within minutes, hashtags like non-Queen Regent, a royal crisis, and where is the king dominated worldwide trends. Every citizen had an opinion, every journalist a theory. Some proclaimed it a historic act of trust, preparing the heir for inevitable succession. Others whispered darker possibilities, illness, conspiracy, betrayal from within. Parliament, caught completely unprepared, descended into frenzy. Leaders demanded clarity while opposition parties demanded transparency. Yet the palace maintained its silence. The longer that silence stretched, the louder the nation's anxiety grew. By midday, anxious crowds, camera crews, and tourists gathered outside Buckingham under gray skies, waiting for a statement that never arrived. What did emergency proclamation mean in a kingdom bound by centuries of rigid protocol? Why was the king's voice absent during this crucial hour? For the people, confusion transformed into deep unease. For the monarchy, this represented more than a mere power shift. It was a test of survival. The proclamation declared Catherine as Queen Regent of Britain, a title unheard for generations. This marked not just a transition, but a transformation, a rewriting of royal order that would permanently scar history. As evening descended and the nation's pulse quickened, one truth emerged from the whispers. This wasn't ceremonial symbolism. This was an act born of desperation, forged in urgency, and sealed with fear. Behind the polished announcement lay a darker urgency, one few dared imagine. In the weeks before the proclamation, something inside Buckingham Palace shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. Those closest to the king noticed. The late-night solitary walks, the closed-door meetings excluding even his most loyal advisors, the quiet, distant look haunting his eyes during public appearances. To the outside world, it seemed like mere fatigue. But inside the palace walls, people spoke of something deeper, a growing unease no one could name aloud. Something, or someone, had shaken his confidence in his own rule. The whispers began quietly behind velvet curtains and in hushed corridors, but this time they carried weight. Courtiers who had served 3 monarchs spoke of a tension they hadn't felt since the darkest days following Diana's death. Staff reported sleepless nights, permanently drawn curtains, and conversations ending abruptly when footsteps approached. The king's composure, that signature steadiness he'd maintained since his coronation, was crumbling under an invisible weight. This wasn't illness haunting him now. It was something far more dangerous. Doubt. Then came the dossier. No one outside the palace's highest echelon ever saw it, but those who did could never forget. A slim, leather-bound file delivered late one evening by a courier whose identity remains classified. Inside, it allegedly contained evidence of constitutional sabotage, a quiet movement to undermine royal authority through backdoor influence and hidden signatures. The document's contents shocked royal offices to their core. While no one would confirm its authenticity, the dossier's mere existence plunged the monarchy into silent panic. During this time, Catherine's role became impossible to ignore. Once seen as merely a calming figure of unity, she began appearing at late-night briefings seated beside the king, while senior officials exchanged uneasy glances. Her calm presence contrasted sharply with the atmosphere of fear surrounding her. Some interpreted it as loyalty, others saw it as preparation. But one thing became clear: Catherine was no longer merely a bystander. She had positioned herself at the heart of whatever decision was being shaped behind those gilded doors. Then came the betrayal. A trusted aide, whose name was deliberately withheld from all records, broke the unspoken code of silence. Late one night, an encrypted message reached a journalist's inbox containing a single phrase: "Emergency protocol activated." Attached was a redacted memo bearing the king's own signature. Within hours, the document vanished from every server, but not before igniting a frenzy of speculation. What could be so grave that the monarch would invoke an emergency clause unused since wartime? Inside the palace, tempers flared. The king convened a confidential council with Catherine, William, and 2 senior advisors. Eyewitnesses described raised voices, accusations, and a chilling silence following William's question: "Is this about the crown or about you?" The king didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was written across his face. He was being forced to choose between protecting the monarchy or preserving fragments of his own legacy. By dawn, his decision was made. The wheels were set in motion for what the world would soon know as the Emergency Proclamation. Within those walls, something profoundly human had taken place. A moment of weakness, fear, and surrender. A king realized that power isn't inherited but borrowed, and that even a monarch can lose control of his own story. Yet even as this truth burned within the palace, the real power struggle was only beginning. While the world saw Catherine as the serene Princess of Wales, insiders knew another truth, one forged in quiet strength and quiet rebellion. For months, she had been preparing for something larger, something even her husband didn't fully understand. Her rise wasn't sudden, nor was it accidental. It was deliberate, careful, and concealed beneath layers of grace. She had mastered the art of stillness, the ability to move without appearing to move at all. When others hesitated, she listened. When others spoke, she observed. In the silence between power and perception, Catherine built her throne. Long before the world would call her Queen Regent, Catherine had already begun influencing decisions that truly mattered. Senior advisors would later admit that her council often shaped outcomes bearing the king's signature. She learned that true power doesn't require a crown, only the ability to steer those who wear one. Every document, every appointment, every whisper through palace corridors bore her fingerprint, not through defiance but through subtle persuasion. To the untrained eye, she remained the dutiful wife. But to those watching closely, she was becoming the monarchy's quiet strategist. Her mind was her greatest weapon. While others clung to tradition, Catherine reached beyond it. She consulted constitutional scholars under the guise of royal research, exploring precedents few dared mention. Her conversations with the archbishop cemented her understanding of duty, divine right, and how faith could anchor power when politics wavered. Through those discussions, she gained something rarer than approval. She earned trust. The church recognized in her a moral steadiness reminiscent of an era when monarchy still commanded reverence. But Catherine's vision stretched further. Her relationship with the military quietly deepened. Generals and commanders found her calm, decisive, and unwavering under pressure. They called her the steady hand, the one who never panicked, even in crisis. Slowly, the 2 great institutions defining continuity, the church and the armed forces, began seeing her not merely as Princess of Wales, but as the embodiment of stability itself. Without declaration or ceremony, she was becoming the living symbol of order in a family defined by turmoil. Behind that poise existed conflict. Late nights weighed heavily on her conscience. The struggle between duty and motherhood gnawed at her soul. She knew every step toward destiny carried a cost, the distance it created between herself and the life she once cherished. She wanted to be both mother and monarch, nurturer and navigator of a crumbling dynasty. But as the king's health faltered and the palace tightened around its secrets, Catherine began understanding that love and loyalty would soon stand on opposite sides of the same line. Outside those walls, the public saw her differently. To them, she was the unshakable pillar in an age of royal fatigue, a woman who carried the crown's weight without letting it crush her. Polls showed admiration rising even as the monarchy's reputation declined. People didn't just respect her, they needed her. Amid scandal, illness, and uncertainty, Catherine had become the stabilizer, the single thread keeping Britain's faith in the royal family intact. But stability comes at a price. Beneath calm gestures and perfect smiles, an old rivalry began smoldering. Camilla, once the unchallenged queen, now found herself quietly sidelined, her influence fading with every sealed meeting Catherine attended. Behind closed doors, the tension was palpable, smiles exchanged in public, silence exchanged in private. The two women represented opposite visions of power, one built on endurance, the other on entitlement. Only one would survive the coming storm. As Catherine prepared for destiny, one woman watched in fury and vowed not to be erased. When the proclamation broke, Camilla's reaction wasn't silence, it was rage. For decades, she had fought to be accepted, crowned, and legitimized in the eyes of a nation that never fully forgave her past. She endured years of whispers, cold glances, and quiet judgment, all to finally claim the title she believed she'd earned. But now, with a single signature, her reign was reduced to a shadow. The ink on the king's emergency proclamation had barely dried when Clarence's house erupted. The fury was instant, unrestrained, and deeply personal. Behind those walls, insiders whispered of raised voices, shattered decorum, and words that could never be taken back. Staff who had served her faithfully witnessed a moment they'd never forget. Some heard the thud of a door slammed with finality. Others described tears, disbelief, and a haunting phrase she repeated again and again. After everything we sacrificed. Those who had stood beside her through decades of scrutiny now found themselves torn between loyalty and logic. The crown had spoken, and in doing so had quietly pushed Camilla aside. For some, allegiance remained with the woman they'd followed through scandal and ridicule. For others, the path forward was clear. Catherine was the new center of gravity, the face of a monarchy desperate to survive. The divide was instant. Inside the palace, subtle but unmistakable lines were drawn. Every glance, every whisper carried weight. Staff who once worked seamlessly together now eyed each other with suspicion. Letters were recalled, communications restructured, roles reassigned overnight. The monarchy's internal unity, always fragile, began fracturing under the weight of betrayal. Camilla's anger wasn't rooted merely in power, it was pain. The proclamation wasn't just a constitutional maneuver. It was a personal repudiation, a reminder that even after decades by Charles's side, she would never truly belong to the monarchy's heart. When she confronted the king, the exchange was as raw as it was inevitable. Sources later described the moment as both heartbreaking and explosive. After everything we endured, she allegedly pleaded, after everything we gave up, you do this? But the king's silence spoke louder than any answer. Whether from guilt, weakness, or duty, Charles had chosen the path he believed would preserve the monarchy. Camilla saw it differently, as the ultimate betrayal from the man she believed would stand by her until the end. The crown, she realized, had claimed him again. Outside the palace, the conflict took on a life of its own. Media outlets seized the fracture, transforming it into spectacle. Tabloids divided the nation into warring camps, Team Camilla versus Team Catherine. Every photograph, every royal engagement became ammunition in a silent battle for public favor. Commentators speculated endlessly. Was this a power transition or a quiet coup? While Catherine maintained her silence with unshakable composure, Camilla's absence from official appearances spoke volumes. The contrast between them became the story. One poised, one wounded, one ascendant, one fading. Even within the royal family, the strain grew unbearable. William's relationship with his father, already complicated by loyalty and expectation, grew cold. He stood firmly by Catherine, not as a husband protecting his wife, but as a future monarch defending stability. Father and son, once united by purpose, now spoke in formalities and brief exchanges. Every meeting was tense, every word measured. As their rift widened, the institution's carefully crafted image began unraveling. The palace's communications office scrambled to contain the storm. Press statements were drafted, redrafted, and scrapped. Official photographs were delayed. Public engagements postponed. But the damage was done. The monarchy's polished facade was cracking, and no amount of control could disguise the truth. Power had shifted, and the old order was breaking. As the royal walls trembled under emotion, the nation demanded answers. What had truly prompted this royal emergency? Behind the grandeur and titles existed something deeply human, a frailty no one in the palace wanted to confront. Those close to the king had seen it, though none dared speak. Fatigue settled behind his eyes. Brief unexplained absences from engagements. Papers left unsigned on his desk, waiting far longer than they should. Whispers of routine checks that grew harder to believe. When the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't scandal that shook the monarchy. It was sorrow. The proclamation, it turned out, wasn't born of ambition or manipulation. It was born of necessity, of a race against time. The king's secret illness had forced destiny's hand. For months, the signs were there, quietly hidden, carefully managed. Medical appointments appeared on his schedule under vague titles like private engagement. Doctors entered through back doors in early morning hours. Only a handful of senior aides knew the truth, and even they were forbidden from documenting details. What began as exhaustion became something far more serious. Each passing week brought new concerns, new treatments, new silence. The palace's golden walls became a fortress of secrets. While the public speculated about everything from family feuds to political plots, the real crisis was unfolding within the king himself. Those who knew him longest described a man at war with his own body and his own pride. He continued his duties, shaking hands, giving speeches, pretending nothing was wrong, but the toll was unmistakable. The voice that once carried conviction now trembled with restraint. The steady gait that symbolized leadership had slowed to a careful step. More than physical decline, it was the weight of decision that drained him most, the awareness that his strength, once unshakable, was beginning to fail. In private letters later uncovered by close advisors, the king wrote of an unrelenting fatigue that feels heavier than the crown itself. Catherine saw it all. She noticed the hesitation in his words, the way his hands lingered on armrests after meetings. Her loyalty was no longer just to the crown, it was to the man who wore it. When doctors delivered their prognosis, she didn't weep. Instead, she acted calmly and deliberately. She insisted the monarchy could not appear weakened, that the nation needed reassurance, that continuity, not pity, would preserve the legacy he'd built. In her quiet strength, she gave the king what he could no longer give himself: stability. The Council of Advisors convened in secrecy soon after. Their conversations were clinical, but beneath the protocol lay an unmistakable pulse of dread. One proposal marked in minutes as temporary regency was initially dismissed as premature. But as weeks passed, it became impossible to ignore. The king's condition worsened, and his ability to fulfill state duties waned. A nation could not be ruled from a hospital bed, so the final draft of the proclamation was prepared, not as a transfer of power, but as a shield for the monarchy itself. When the king signed his name, his hand shook slightly. It wasn't weakness, it was acceptance. A monarch acknowledging mortality not as defeat, but as duty. The world would see the act as a bold constitutional move. But those within the palace knew it for what it truly was: an act of love. A final gesture to protect the institution he dedicated his life to, and to entrust it to the one person he believed would carry it forward with dignity. The revelation of his illness softened the nation. Compassion replaced speculation. Even those who had doubted Catherine's appointment now saw the humanity behind it. Yet, as the world's sympathy turned toward the royal family, something else began stirring beneath the surface. A cold, calculated resistance. Even as compassion stirred public hearts, the machinery of politics began moving, and not everyone supported the new Queen Regent. Every crown has its enemies, and Catherine's ascension was no exception. While the public mourned and sympathized with the king's illness and the heavy burden his daughter-in-law now carried, the corridors of power told a different story. Behind the polished doors of Whitehall and the hushed halls of the palace, a quiet rebellion began stirring. The old guard, those who had spent their lives protecting protocol above progress, saw in Catherine not a savior, but a threat. A woman too popular, too composed, too capable of wielding influence that hadn't been formally granted. To them, she wasn't the guardian of the monarchy's future, she was its disruption. The first whispers came in coded conversations. Senior courtiers questioned privately whether the emergency proclamation had even been legal. The Regency Act, they argued, had been bypassed without full parliamentary approval. Temporary authority, one memo read, must not become permanent power. But it was never about legality, it was about control. For decades, these men and women had been the invisible architects of royal continuity. Now, Catherine's calm decisiveness had rendered them irrelevant, and irrelevance was something they couldn't forgive. Leaks began appearing in the press, subtle at first, then increasingly bold. Anonymous sources accused the new Queen Regent of overreach, of sidelining the king's advisors and placing her own confidants in key positions. Headlines began twisting admiration into suspicion. Britain's silent takeover? One paper asked. The palace power shift no one voted for. Each story carried just enough truth to wound, yet not enough to expose its orchestrators. It was political warfare dressed as journalism, a campaign of doubt designed to erode public faith in the woman now holding the crown's reins. Inside Parliament, division deepened. Some MPs rallied behind Catherine's leadership, calling her the steady hand Britain needed in turbulent times. Others saw an opportunity to weaken the monarchy's influence altogether, framing the regency as constitutional overreach. Debates grew heated, and for the first time in years, the question was raised aloud. Should Britain's monarchy continue holding this much power at all? The house that had once bowed to the crown now whispered of reform, its loyalty splintering in real time. Meanwhile, MI5 grew uneasy. Intelligence briefings warned of unusual activity around the palace. Private communications intercepted. Internal documents leaked from encrypted systems. The phrase royal unrest appeared in classified reports, not as metaphor, but as threat. Someone was coordinating from within, exploiting every weakness, every crack in the institution's armor. What began as skepticism had evolved into subversion, and Catherine knew it. Yet she refused to yield. Her inner circle, composed of trusted aides, loyal staff, and a handful of senior officials, worked tirelessly to project unity. Every public appearance was measured, every word deliberate. She understood the game being played and chose not to play it on their terms. Her restraint only deepened her mystique, and the more her opponents tried undermining her, the more the people rallied behind her quiet strength. Catherine also understood that peace within the palace was an illusion. Forces were moving in silence, gathering influence, waiting for the moment to strike. For every public act of loyalty, there was a private whisper of dissent. For every gesture of support, a seed of betrayal. She could feel the walls tightening, not from outside, but from within. Just when the crown's foundation seemed most fragile, Catherine made a move that stunned both allies and enemies. Westminster Abbey stood ready. The air was electric, charged with centuries of ritual and rebellion. As choirs prepared and cameras rolled, one decision changed everything. Catherine refused the crown. In a single gesture, she shattered expectations, choosing duty over glory, service over symbolism. The nation gasped, the monarchy transformed, and for the first time in decades, the royal family stood united, not by ego, but by something deeper: humility. The day had been planned in secrecy, invitations drafted, dignitaries notified, the press kept on edge with promises of a transformational ceremonial declaration. Many assumed it would be her coronation, a grand spectacle marking the dawn of a new chapter. Yet behind closed doors, Catherine had already made her choice. To her, a coronation wasn't a crown, it was a claim. And she had no desire to claim what was never truly hers. The regency's purpose was to safeguard, not to reign. She would lead, yes, but only as the king's guardian, not his successor. The plans shifted overnight. The term coronation disappeared from every official document, replaced with regency ceremony, a subtle change carrying the weight of centuries. When Catherine finally addressed the nation, her words silenced every doubt and every critic. "This crown," she said, her voice steady but warm, "belongs to the people until the king returns. I am merely its keeper." It was a declaration that restored faith to an institution many had grown weary of defending. In an era of power and image, she had chosen restraint, and in doing so became something rarer than a monarch. She became a symbol of trust. The reaction was immediate. Across Britain and beyond, admiration flooded in. Newspapers that had once questioned her legitimacy now printed headlines of reverence. "The People's Regent," they read. Global leaders praised her humility. Religious figures called her words divine wisdom. For the first time in modern memory, the monarchy's approval rating soared. Even skeptics who had doubted the young princess's resolve found themselves disarmed by her simplicity. Catherine had done the unthinkable. She had strengthened the monarchy by refusing to glorify it. Those who knew her best, however, saw the emotion behind the composure. William's eyes betrayed both pride and heartbreak. He understood what she'd given up. The life of quiet anonymity she once longed for, the comfort of being only a wife and mother. In choosing the crown's burden, she had also chosen sacrifice. Yet there was no resentment between them, only respect. In public, his gaze lingered on her, not as a royal consort, but as a witness to her quiet courage. It was a look that said what words could not: "You are doing what history demands." Meanwhile, Camilla retreated from view. Her appearances ceased, her public engagements cancelled without explanation. Some said she was ill, others whispered she'd left London altogether. But within royal circles, it was understood. She had seen enough. The new era was no longer hers to shape. The nation that had once hesitated to embrace Catherine now adored her, and no title or past grievance could undo that truth.